down a few trees in Brazil. What do we even need trees for anyway?
Is deforestation. Deforestation is the permanent destruction of forests in order to make land available for other uses. It occurs all around the world through tropical rainforests are particularly targeted. So what's the problem with this, you may be wondering? 63% of the Amazon rainforest is located in Brazil, and for many years, the rainforest was being taken advantage of. Many of Brazil's deforestation problems have occurred in the past, and now the country is trying to figure out how to save the rest of the rainforest. The onslaught of the Amazon began in the early 1960s. Although enormous parts of the rainforest are still intact, the rate of forest loss is dramatic, and especially in what's called the arc of deforestation, along the southern and eastern edges of Brazil. There are major concerns with the massive amount of deforestation, like biodiversity loss and climate impacts. Because deforestation is such a huge issue, today we'll take a look at the history of the deforestation, as well as the causes and the effects, and then we'll discuss the surprising improvements that could just be the saving of Brazil's future. So let's talk about the history. The history of Brazil is important to understand to see how all this deforestation happened in the first place. In the 1940s, the president of Brazil, Vargas, started a program of national development in the Amazon basin. He wanted to exploit the forest for agriculture and extractive industry. And in the 1960s, deforestation of the Brazilian Amazon took way. It picked up very quickly because they wanted to clear the land for cattle ranching to raise their national revenues to pay off debts. The world price for beef was very high at that point, so they wanted to have a bunch of cattle to help pay off national debt. However, before the 1960s, much of the forest remained intact because there were restrictions on the Amazon. But the turning point for deforestation of the Amazon was when the colonists established farms within the forest during the 1960s. However, the soil in the Amazon was not great for growing crops, as the colonists quickly realized. So they began using a method called slash and burn. Slash and burn is the process of cutting down vegetation in particular areas, setting it on fire, and then using those ashes to provide nutrients for the soil for different types of farming practices. The only problem with this is that you can only use the land for a short period of time before needing to let the vegetation grow back again. So the colonists had to constantly be moving, clearing more and more forest along the way. So they began cattle ranching in the area of the Brazilian rainforests, and it was very effective for Brazil, besides the poor soil, because it could still grow grass for the cattle to eat. So ranching was very popular because it required little labor and made a really great profit. One of the biggest factors in history that led to a massive deforestation rates in 1964 was what's called the Brazilian Land Law. There was a provision which supported the ownership of land by the one who cultivated it or produced on it. If a person could demonstrate the effective use, which meant cultivation for a year plus 1 day, then the person could claim holding on that land. This basically just means that the land that they started using after a year and 1 day became theirs. The government could define effective use very loosely, which ended up resulting in clearing enormous amounts of the forest for cattle production, displacing the people who lived in the forest, and creating large cattle pastures. The government during this time ended up issuing about 12 million acres in land titles to different people for different purposes. Finally, in the 1960s, the Trans-Amazonian Highway grew, which attracted hundreds of thousands of farmers westward into the Amazon to exploit the forest for cattle ranchers. Between 1966 and 1975, the Amazon land values grew by a rate of 100% each year, as the government offered subsidies to reform the land. This incentive drove tons of people to Brazil, and by the late 1980s, areas the size of England, Scotland, and Wales were being removed annually. However, as for today, in 2005, the former president, Luiz Salva, announced an ambitious goal of slashing the deforestation rate by 80%. After that, things really started to turn around for Brazil. From 2009 to 2012, the rates have been steadily declining from about 27,000 kilometers a year, or kilometers a year, to just 7,600 kilometers. Brazil has made tremendous steps in saving the original Amazon forest, and with help from the Forest Code being updated in 2012, it now requires landowners to preserve 80% of the Amazon forest as well as a protected watershed. And those who violate those rules have increasingly received fines and even jail time in extreme cases. So you may be wondering, now that you know some of the history of Brazil and how the deforestation started to happen, what are the direct causes of deforestation? And over the years, Brazil has encountered tons of different reasons for deforestation, like illegal logging, construction of highways, farming, ranching, and even construction of hydroelectric dams. But one of the biggest causes for deforestation in the Brazilian Amazon is due to cattle ranching and infrastructure. 91% of the land deforestation since 1970 was being used for livestock raising. According to the Center for International Forestry Research, between the 1990s and 2001, the percent of Europe's processed meat imports that came from Brazil rose from 40% to 74%. In addition to Vargas's president in the 1960s, his desire to commercialize the country, the Brazilian real against the dollar had resulted in doubling the price of beef, which in turn gave ranchers a huge incentive to expand and clear more and more forests. As well as the improvements to the Trans-Amazonian Highway, as I mentioned before, ranchers now had access to areas that they would have never previously had, which caused deforestation rates to rise yet again. Another big cause is because Brazil is the second largest global producer of soybeans. Just like beef, as prices of soybeans increase, the soy farmers push north towards the forested areas of the Amazon. An American company has been said to be speeding up the process of deforestation in the Amazon. Cargill, who controls the majority of soybean trades in Brazil, is forced time and time again to expand its soybean production by cutting down and clearing parts of the Amazon to meet the demand for customers like McDonald's. Lastly, logging has contributed to deforestation rates in Brazil. Again, this is an economically motivated activity. Logging for timber exports is selective since only a few trees have high commercial value, woods like mahogany. But the problem with this is that although the whole forest doesn't need to be logged, for every tree they harvest, it's estimated that about 5 to 10 other trees have to be logged in order to access the transportation of these logs in and out of the forest. Also, a big falling tree takes out a lot of little trees on its way down, and taking out these little trees leaves the forest very vulnerable to different types of fires. So what's the big deal, you may be wondering at this point? So some trees are taken down. They need a way to support their economy, right? Well, there are a lot of negative effects to this type of dramatic deforestation. Deforestation lowers the level of biodiversity that can be available within the forest. The removal of animals' habitats through plants and trees is forcing some species to face extinction. It also lessens the ability of genetic variation, which will be needed in the future when the climate starts to change. Rainforests are known to have very diverse and complex ecosystems. So when these trees are removed, the ecosystems are put at jeopardy. One of the other big issues with deforestation is the effect on the water cycle. Trees absorb much of the water in the Earth's atmosphere and holds it within their ecosystem, and then slowly releases some of the gases back into the air. With the loss of trees also comes the loss of water that is able to circulate within the ecosystem, therefore leaving arid land behind that is unusable for farming, which is a huge problem in Brazil. And lastly, one of the biggest effects is a global effect, which is climate change. The rainforests have vital importance in the CO2 exchange and are second only to oceans at the most important sink on the planet for absorbing the increasing atmospheric CO2 rates. The deforestation in Brazil is responsible for roughly 10% of the greenhouse emissions in the environment due to the removal of forests, which would have otherwise been able to absorb these emissions. Deforestation perpetuates the effect of global warming in this way. Slash and burn techniques, as I talked about earlier, are also emitting high levels of CO2 into the atmosphere, which is affecting the air quality. So bad in some places in Brazil that airports have had to shut down and people have been hospitalized for smoke inhalation. But there have been recent actions that are taking place to slow and stop deforestation rates that do have promising results. So let's talk about a few of those. There are actions being taken to save the future of Brazil because the people are concerned and they're not sure what lays ahead for their country. However, according to a National Geographic article from June of 2014, the country has reduced its deforestation rates by 70% and kept 3.2 billion tons of CO2 out of the atmosphere. And I have to say, Brazil does deserve some praise for that. That's great. This makes Brazil the biggest reduction in greenhouse gas emissions of any country in the world. The cut is more than 3 times bigger than the effect of taking all the cars in the US off the road for an entire year. And this may sound great, but they really also needed to do this. Another concern was what would happen if they couldn't expand their land anymore because they put regulations on expanding their forests. They were concerned of how they could keep up their production. But actually, landowners have increased their overall production of beef and soybeans over the past decade. And that's because they've been forced to focus on making their farms more efficient in their productivity levels, because they no longer have the option of clearing more and more land. There was a slight increase in deforestation rates in 2003, with a bit of an unknown reason. Some believe it was due to weather patterns, as well as the raising global demand for food. However, the government again has been taking the steps to stop this. A new government program requires landowners to register their usage plans, which should help keep better tabs in managing the forest. All in all, Brazil has made an incredible transition from the 1960s with the intent to exploit all the forests for all of its resources, to the 2000s, where Brazilians understand the importance of saving the rainforests and their impact on their country as well as the surrounding world.
Now that I understand the harmful effects of deforestation, I think it's time to hang up the axe.
With a wind-up souvenir, I bought it downtown as I was on my way to meet